and the sea's just a great metaphor. It's always changing. It's never the same, and I love the fact that it doesn't care. It doesn't care. You can fight it. You can have the best technology. It doesn't care. It will destroy you. It's just this brilliant like monster.
All right, welcome everyone to episode 31 of SFF Addicts, where we'll be sailing the high seas, chatting about nautical fantasy. For me, the ocean has always had a mysterious allure to it, starting in my youth growing up on the rocky shores of British Columbia. So when I started to encounter fantasy books that incorporated seafaring and all that kind of stuff, it just blew my mind. And there's still so much that I don't know about the incredible nautical fantasy subgenre, but I'm honored to have these three authors here with me to help broaden my perspectives. And first up is Andrea Stewart, making her third appearance on SFF Addicts. She's the author of The Bone Shard Daughter and its sequel, The Bone Shard Emperor, books 1 and 2 in the Drowning Empire series. So good to see you again. How are you, Andrea?
I'm good. Thanks for having me.
Oh, pleasure as always. And my next two guests are making first appearances on the show, including RJ Barker. He's the author of the Tide Child trilogy and the Wounded Kingdom series. And he also has the most flowy locks to ever grace this podcast. So thank you for being here, RJ.
Thank you. I'm a bit coldy, so I'll try not to cough all the way through this.
You could cuss. It's all good. And last but not least, Joshua Phillip Johnson. He's the author of The Forever Sea, including the Forever Sea series, including The Forever Sea and its upcoming sequel, The Endless Song, which is out in January. So congrats on that upcoming release, Joshua, and welcome.
Thank you. It's good to be here.
Yeah, it's great to have you here. And I'm just very excited to talk about this because I love the ocean. But to get the panel started, I would like to know for each of you, what draws you to the vast and mysterious ocean? So RJ, we'll start with you.
It terrifies me. And I love it. And a lot of my very earliest memories are going to the sea with my family. And the British, the sort of North Sea where we go is quite an aggressive sea. It's very tidal, and you get these massive waves coming up and crashing over everything and soaking you. And my dad was a sailor. My dad did a lot of tall ship sailing, so he would talk to me about it. And that's kind of turned into a love of stuff like Hornblower and all these sort of naval books. And then I found Patrick O'Brian, and I was just in love with what he does. And the sea's just a great metaphor. It's always changing. It's never the same. And I love the fact that it doesn't care. It doesn't care. You can fight it. You can have the best technology. It doesn't care. It will destroy you. It's just this brilliant like monster. I love it. And the smell, everything. It's just so romantic. It gets me excited just thinking about it.
It's like on one hand it's terrifying and on the other it's romantic and beautiful. Yeah, I totally agree.
It's like a couple of girls I went out with when I was a teenager.
You're terrifying but beautiful. And Andrew, what about you? What draws you to the sea?
Oh, well, I would echo a lot of what RJ said. I just think it's like a very kind of sensory experience. There's the sound of the waves, there's the feel of the water, there's the smell of it. For me, like I've been swimming since a very young age, so I just really like water, and also like I like to scuba dive on the occasion. And I just like that sense of mystery about it where, you know, you're on the surface, but once you go below, there's just so much down there that you just don't know about. Yeah. And it's cool, but also like a little bit creepy. So I just love that it's got like so many interesting elements that you can play with.
Yeah, the first time I went scuba diving, I had just a crazy experience of like, you know, obviously it's freezing because it was on Vancouver Island off the coast of British Columbia, but it was like at the same time, there's so much there. And
it's really neat.
We're like, when it comes to the water, we're just useless creatures, but it's so cool to be able to see that.
I've been scuba diving up near Vancouver too. It's pretty neat.
Yeah.
I've
And
only
Josh,
done it a couple of times, but it's like flying. It's wonderful as scuba diving.
yeah, just like that sensory experience is amazing. And Joshua, what about you?
Yeah, I grew up in the Midwest in the United States, and so I'm about as far from an ocean as you can get. And so my first experience or my first exposure to the sea, we have a lot of lakes where I am, and lakes are different sort of, it's the place where rich white people go to sit, sort of scoot their boats around a little bit. But I think my first experience was through stories. And so, a lot of what both Andrea and RJ have talked about is sort of my experience too, but I sort of got it filtered through narratives. And so the ocean as a metaphor for bigger things, or a sort of place on which journeys happen or things like that, was always really appealing to me. And, it seemed like as a kid, every one of my favorite fantasy novels ended with people sailing off across some ocean to go somewhere better. And so, I always thought like, man, I got to get across the ocean to somewhere better. So yeah.
Oh, well, on that note, I mean, I was curious, Joshua, you just brought up narratives as your sort of source material for your relationship with the sea, but are there any particular pieces of nautical fiction, whether it's a book or even movies and TV, that you really remember and stand out to you?
Yeah, so I saw Jaws at probably too early an age, and it really, the stuff that Andrea is talking about it being terrifying, I think really, any amount of water for a long time, a cup or a toilet full of water or something, I thought, who knows what could be in there? I don't know. And so I saw that, but I think in terms of books, I read Moby Dick when I was younger, and revisited it more recently, and I don't know that people talk about it as being some gargantuan piece of fiction that everyone should read, and I don't know about that, but I think that one stands out to me. I've read some of the Master and Commander books and really love those. China Miéville's The Scar is one that I like think about a lot and come back to, and so but there's stuff about like what in the Lord of the Rings, it's like I'm gonna it's like the Golden Harbors or the Gray Havens or something like that, right? Yeah. Where all the elves go, and so it seems like so many books have sort of nautical stuff sort of woven through them. Even like what the third Earthsea book, The Farthest Shore, has Ged sort of like sailing around to find the source of magic disappearing. And so I think when I think back over a lot of my favorite books, the sea is sort of present in some way.
Yeah, I love that. Andrea, what about you?
Yeah, I was also going to mention Wizard of Earthsea because that was kind of formative for me as a kid, just sailing around on the islands. And also, like I read the Narnia books as a kid as well, and I was really into them and watched like the BBC that they did like the whole. Anyways, my absolute favorite one was Voyage of the Dawn Treader. I just loved that idea of them going to these different islands, and there's like these mysteries on each of them, and like sailing to the edge of the world. It just was eye-opening for me.
I love Voyage of the Dawn Treader too. And Joshua, you brought up Master and Commander. My brother is now like a naval officer in the British Navy. Wow. And he made me watch Master and Commander, and it was just like kind of resented him for it because I'm like, this is long and boring. But then I went back and watched it. It was so freaking good. But then Voyage of the Dawn Treader was that book that really just kind of like captured it for me. And also The Goonies, even though that's not like a nautical book, it takes place on the coast and they end up finding like pirate treasure. And I just remember that boat, the image of like them entering into that cave and seeing that giant old ship was so freaking cool, which is why, like Pirates of the Caribbean was so visually stunning, even though like narratively it degraded very quickly, but that's either here or there. RJ, what about you? What were some books or TV shows or movies that you remember that really stuck out to you?
I think Voyage of the Dawn Treader definitely is one that I read when I was very young, and that stuck in my head. And then Hornblower, which is kind of your naval fiction starter, I think, in it's much more adventure-y and easy to get into. And then the Master and Commander books, which are probably some of my favourite books I've ever read. They're just beautiful and funny and well written and a lot stranger. They're very like fantasy in that they're books that don't, well, fantasy as I write it, in that they drop you into a world and they don't take any prisoners. They don't explain anything. They talk as those people would have spoken, and they don't tell you what anything is. And one of my favorite reading experiences was about being about 2/3 through the first one and suddenly thinking, oh, that bit's at the front of the boat. And this world slowly coming to life as I started to understand its vocabulary, which is what I wanted to do when I was writing the Bone Ships. And as well as that, Godzilla, not the Japanese versions, the rubbish 80s cartoon.
I've never seen
I don't think so. Oh, it's terrible. But I love it. It's where we got Godzuki from. And I will not have a bad word to say. I like Godzuki. But there's something about this huge thing that lives under the sea that really fascinates me. And then in the most recent Western version of Godzilla, there's a shot where you see Godzilla swim underneath an aircraft carrier.
Yep.
And something about that was just like, I like that. And I think that's probably the genesis of the Bone Ships books, is in that shot. So if you don't like them, it's his fault.
Blame Godzilla.
Yeah, it's Godzilla's fault. Take it up with him, and I happen to know he loves them. So
take it up with that radioactive monster.
Yeah.
Well, RJ, on that note, you brought it up that this shot in Godzilla was really formative in terms of your ideas for what eventually became the Bone Ships. But why do you think the ocean, as well as like seafaring vessels and that kind of setting, is so ripe for fantasy stories in particular?
I don't think just fantasy. I think the ocean's just brilliant. From what we said earlier on about it being a metaphor, but the thing that I like about it as a writer, it is, if you're writing about a ship, you've created a pressure cooker. It's an environment that nobody can escape. They're stuck within it. They whatever drama happens between the crew has to be worked out. They have no option. They can't escape. Can't get away. And also, these people, they can hate it. They can hate this life, but they also rely on it to keep them alive. And I like that. And I love the way that the rhythm of the ship, because they are. It's very. If as a naval officer, you'll know this. It's a very regimented life and to some degree boring. It repeats itself. And I love the way that's mirrored by the sea with the tides. And that interests me as a writer. And I use repetition a lot in the books to kind of get over this idea of the sea. And I think that's what I liked about it. I kind of, it creates situations. And it's an extra enemy. It's not, it's a different enemy. It's not, back to that thing about being uncaring. It's a constant and present danger, but it's something you also rely on and something you also love. And that's a really nice and complicated way for somebody to feel.
Yeah, it's like there's relationships between the characters, but then there's also relationships between them and their environment. Yeah, I really love that.
And them and the ship and them and the sea and why they're there. And a big tradition of running away to sea and getting away from it, which is stupid because you get really seasick, if you're me.
Ironic, isn't it?
Yeah. I'm never going to be a sailor.
That's okay. And Andrea, what about you? What do you think is particularly fitting about, seafaring vessels and the ocean and all that kind of stuff? I think RJ, you made a good point, not just for fantasy, but just for storytelling in general.
Yeah, I mean, for me, I knew I wanted to have my book set on an archipelago of islands, and I really liked that kind of idea of these islands all being part of the same empire, but each having their own like individuality, and people having to travel between them, and each one having like their own like kind of cultures. I mean, there's more reasons, but I just really, really gravitated toward that. I mean, not just like the element of sea travel, but the fact that these communities were connected in a way, but also distinctly separate.
Yeah. And then Joshua, for yours as well, it's like, You mentioned that you grew up in the Midwest, and you set your story in a world that is, an endless grass sea. So it's taking a lot of yeah. No, you didn't cheat. Fuck it. It's fiction. It's fine.
It's such a good idea. I was so jealous when it came out. Oh, we should have done that.
Yeah.
So, What
was
was your particular thought process for that? But also, why do you think that being able to use fantasy as this sort of foundational playground where you can make a big change like that?
Yeah, it's such an interesting question. I mean, so for me, the way that I sort of got to thinking about this was I was just out for a walk one day. It's really windy where I live, and it's mostly not prairie grasses around here anymore. It's mostly corn and soybeans, but there's still little patches that you can find. And so I was walking along one of these, and the wind was sort of moving through it, and it just looks like you can sort of see tides, right? It looks like the sea. If you've ever seen, sort of native prairie grasses, they're really tall. They're beautiful, but when wind cuts through them, it looks like the ocean to me. Mm-hmm. And so the leap from sort of seeing that and thinking like, oh, that sort of looks like water, to thinking I should put some boats on that. And then, the extrapolation almost happens by itself. So, and I think in terms of like sort of nautical stories, I think the thing that RJ was talking about earlier about like getting plopped into a story, mm-hmm. One of the real appeals for me is that like fantasy, I think as a genre is really often interested in language. I think we're really good at coming up with language and thinking about the richness of language. And, ship stories are all about this, right? They have their own language that's mm-hmm. so unique, and it's really beautiful. It's really rhythmic. It's really melodic, but it's also really sort of functional and cool. And so we do all this world building in our fantasy novels. And I sort of feel like the nautical world has already built its own little world over there that you walk into and you're sort of like, oh my gosh, like there are all of these words that I have no idea what they mean, and there's no way I could spell them based on how you're pronouncing them, and all of the stuff, and so there's something about that. And I also just think like there's something sort of wondrous in sailing, or sort of being on a big body of water, or in my case maybe a big body of grass, mm-hmm. In part because you don't know what's below, in part because of this stuff about like it's essentially like a big bottle episode, right? You can't leave. You can swim out there maybe, but this is it, right? For a little while. And so there's some sort of natural built-in tension, but there's also just something like wondrous about it, I think. And I think fantasy as the genre, maybe in a different way than some other genres, or in a unique way, I don't know, has sort of elements of wonder, I think, sort of baked in. And so it seems like a really natural partnership in that way.
Mm-hmm. And you brought up a bunch of good points, and we're going to touch on a lot of them throughout this conversation. But Andrea, I'll toss it back to you. I want to get back to this thing, Joshua, that you brought up about language, which I think is really interesting because nautical life is very full of storytelling and folklore and song, and the things. RJ, you were bringing up this rhythm earlier. I feel like song and storytelling is a natural fit for the rhythm of repetition and work when you're on a ship. And Andrea, I wanted to get your take on why do you think, in our real world, we have like pirates and naval history and all these different kinds of things in our own folklore, and how you kind of approached that idea of narrative and folklore and storytelling on the sea or between these islands in the drowning empire in a fantasy world that kind of that compares to our own in some ways, but also contrasts in a lot of others.
It's funny that you mentioned that because I actually like wrote up some folklore that people tell each other, like stories that they tell one another.
Nice.
But you only get like mentions of it in the actual book. But I feel like it was important to have that there because the ocean is like this big mysterious thing to people, and we do tell a lot of stories about it. I mean, you look at back in the day when people were sailing the ocean, they didn't know what was in it, and they just like, if they saw something, they're like, oh well, that's a sea serpent, mm-hmm. Right? And they tell these stories about that. So I made sure that I had that kind of mythology in my own world where in the world that I built, like the sea is basically endless. Like they don't know where the bottom is. So it's very vast to them. So of course they're going to have stories they tell each other about things that they thought that they saw in there. There are also like stories about like sea serpents that have grown like enormous, like just I think that some of it may be real and some of it may have been elaborated upon by their imagination.
Mhm.
But I do think that people have always had that tendency to tell stories and to elaborate on just maybe like a small thing that they saw. So yeah, while you don't get a straight out like, hey, let me tell you this story about the ocean in my book,
Mhm.
like I definitely have like mentions of these things that people tell one another.
Yeah, I love that. And like for sure, it's like the tinderbox of the ship and this close confines kind of thing. It's like people naturally gossip, and the thing that they're going to gossip about is like, oh, I was up on the mast and just like looking out for whatever danger, et cetera, and I saw something. And it's like the way that the human brain works and the tricks that perception plays on the brain. And for someone to be like, okay, I'm on a ship and now I'm like, sleeping on my hammock or something. I'm going to spin a crazy tale about something that I saw, even though I had like the smallest bit of information that I just weave into an elaborate and ridiculous yarn kind of thing. Yeah. RJ, what about you? You actually have some chapters in the Tile Child books that you start with sort of like sea shanties and stuff like that as well. But folklore does play a big role in those books as well.
Yeah, originally I think the title for them was not The Tide Child; it was The Song of Lucky Mayas, and my publisher Albert went, "Shall we?" And I was like, "Yes," and they were like, "No," but it was really weird that I ended up doing so many songs throughout it all, because I am that person who, when you say Lord of the Rings, go, "Oh yeah, well, skip all the singing." And I do in almost anything I read. I'm just like, no, singing, gone. But it ended up being.
It's not the Lord of the Rings anymore. Come on.
No, because it felt right, and also it. When you want to say things, but you could be really careful because you will ruin the entire 3 books if you say too much. I'm in that position. And the sea shanties are also a storytelling device that give you clues to what's coming, and what has gone on before, and it's a very folkloric world, because I'm fascinated by that. And one of the conceits of the books is that they're presented to you kind of as folklore. The first words of it are "Give me your hat," and then the next one is they're not the words you expect to start a legend, but that was what she said. So yeah, I kind of want to start with this feel that maybe you've sat down with somebody in an inn and they're telling you this story before we went into the story. So that folklore is central to these books, and legend, and it plays such a huge part that I can't actually talk about it without completely ruining it for anyone who hasn't read them. But yeah, I love that. Folklore turns up in everything I do, because I've always been fascinated what lives in the hedge. And there is definitely in Yorkshire a story about what lives in the hedge. Some old bloke will tell you, run into him, they'll tell you it. And I've grown up with that, so I like my worlds to have that.
Mm-hmm.
But yeah, folklore and songs are important for my books, but I can't talk about them because my publisher will kill me. Yeah. yeah, read the books. Yeah,
deal with it, Orbit, whatever. Joshua, all 3 of you actually have touched on world building a little bit here and there. I think secondary worlds, I love that fantasy gave you that ability to expand upon influences from the real world, but give more depth to your own creativity as individuals with secondary worlds. And I was curious, what were some of the challenges, but also what were some of the sort of what I would call like plot gold mines that arose from this process of being able to create a world from whole cloth? Joshua, do you want to start?
Sure. Yeah, it's a good question. Yeah, I think for me, just like in some ways, like in any fantasy novel, right? For me, part of the fun is in this sort of extrapolation that happens. So you change your little 1 what if thing, or maybe your 10 what if things. and you say like, I'm going to imagine a world like this. And then a lot of the fun is in like, okay, well, if that's like this, then, 10 sort of notches down the line, you discover this thing. And so I think for me, my big change in the books is that, I think the big change in the books is that this is a sea of grass, but people treat it in lots of ways like a sea of water. It's a thing to be sort of traversed. It's a thing that can bring wealth, right? There's sort of economic benefits to it. It's a thing that people try and own and try and control in various ways. But as soon as you start thinking of it as a sea of grass as opposed to water, it becomes different, right? You can swim in water, but you can't swim in grass. And so, thinking about like the literalization of this thing that Andrea was talking about, like what's down there, right? Becomes a more pressing thing when you can't sort of float on top of it in the same way. If you fall off the ship, you're going to see what's down there after a little while, right? And so, I think for me, a lot of the sort of plot gold mines we're thinking about, or just the sort of interesting things that came about, we're thinking about like, how does this affect people, and what does it mean to like live next to this thing and kind of have it like rubbing on your consciousness every day, right? And so this idea, this thing about like folklore and myth and the stories that we spin as ways to kind of like mediate our exposure to things we don't really understand or we're not sure about or that we're afraid of, I think can be really fun. And so for me, a lot of the fun is in like, here's this myth about this world, or here's this thing that people fear about the world or whatever it might be. And we get both like the sort of, it's like looming over characters as they go through their lives. And then at a certain point, perhaps in book 2, they get the sort of the sort of reality of what that might be. And so you get this kind of, here's the truth and here's the myth that we've spun about it, and how do those things relate to each other. So
yeah, I love that. It's like the myth and the truth. That is a very interesting dichotomy. And Andrea, you play with that too in the Drowning Empire series. And we've talked about world building previously in some of our conversations about like the ways in which the world itself ties into the myths that people are telling each other in daily life. So it's like the way that there's these floating islands, there's this sort of mystery to, the way that the islands migrate, or what you were saying earlier about like what is down there in the seemingly endless depths, and how does, a mythical creature start to come into play and kind of mess around there. So for you particularly, like when you were creating the secondary world, what kind of challenges arose during that process? And then from the world building, even if it was, purposeful or accidental kind of thing, what were some of those gold mines that you discovered?
Well, the most difficult thing is, I think, like sailing is really complicated. So I started to do like all this reading and everything, and I'm like, okay, like what is the terminology, and like how do you sail into the wind and all of this stuff, And I'm like reading and I'm like, oh my God, like I'm already like writing this really complicated plot. So I read a bunch of stuff and I ended up just kind of like throwing it out and like doing a bunch of hand wavy things instead. Like I'm like, I'm gonna mention this as little as possible.
Same. Big same.
Yeah, because it's funny how you don't realize how complicated it is until you start reading about it.
Exactly.
I was like, oh yeah, sailing, how hard can it be, right? So that was definitely a big challenge for me. So I had to kind of find ways to kind of glide around it and not mention it too much, because like I said, I didn't want to overcomplicate it, especially since the minutia of sailing didn't relate as much to my plot. So that was a challenge. I think as far as like things that popped up, like as I was building my world, like one of the things that I like to make sure is that the unique parts of the world are somehow related to the plot and to the characters. So you're not like losing them, like you're like, oh, like this thing is so cool. And then 50 pages later, you're like, you've forgotten that it was something that exists. So with the whole migratory islands thing, I'm like, well, if they're migrating and they have this schedule, and they're moving around, then it's going to be even more complicated to navigate between the islands. So there's this whole class of people that do that are navigators. And, I had one of my main characters who had studied to be a navigator, and that like relates to his schooling and like how he grew up and his background and his resentments, and that all comes up throughout the books. But yeah, so that was like one of the things that I kind of had one world building aspect that just trickled into a lot of other things. So I really, really kind of enjoy that process.
Yeah.
I do think it's difficult to keep track of, though. Like, I mean, that's the challenge of epic fantasy, right? You're like, oh yeah, like this island over here has this thing, and then you forget about it, and you have to have a wiki. So yeah.
Well, yeah. I mean, if it's difficult for you as the author, then it's doubly difficult for the reader to kind of keep track of that stuff. And info dumping is this thing that people shit on fantasy or sci-fi for a lot. But it's like, yeah, you can trickle in the exposition through conversation, through dialogue. I think nautical scenarios kind of play well to that, because it's like people are having a lot of conversation, even if it's like, barking orders at somebody. There's still an opportunity to give someone some clear information about your world, or the migration of islands, or the myth of an endless grass sea and things like that. RJ, for you, when you were approaching the Bone Child and expanding that across the trilogy, how did you kind of approach the world building there? And then at the same time, it's like I was asking Andrea and Joshua, what kind of challenges arose, or what kind of gold mines did you hit?
Like Andrea's, mine does rely on the minutiae of sailing, which is a mistake. And she's right. Don't do it. It's bad. I quickly realized I could either get sailing right or I could hit my deadline. And there was no in between. And there's an apology in the back of the first book that just says, look, if you actually understand sailing, I'm sorry, but I just made it up as much as I could. And I get the odd email from sailors saying, yeah, you really don't understand sailing. But the nicest thing is nearly all of them also say, but you've captured it, which is what I wanted. I wanted it to feel like sailing. And a lot of people who do sail said, yeah, it feels like being on a ship. But your ship would not work. I'm sure magic. Fancy. The other thing that I really enjoyed is it's the matriarchy is the world of the bone ships. So you flip the power structure that we're used to, and the way they talk about ships is not the way. You don't have a captain, you have a shipwife. And ships are male in their world because you have a shipwife, and she is married, or he, to that ship. That has led to some very interesting email. Some people mix weirdly cross, and well, shut off.
Deal with it.
But that was really interesting, mostly for me, because it sent me off into why we think of ships as female, and it's really interesting to do with them being nurturing and looking after you. And there is a whole idea that the captain is married to the ship, which is where shipwife came from. But I think the biggest gold mine in it was I was just, because I don't world build in any big thought. I don't like have a book or anything. I have a few things, and then I write in the world, and that's how I discover it. That works for me usually. So far, I should say, touch wood. But I was just thinking that if this world is all islands, which it is, the predominant life form should be birds. And it makes sense because they can easily move between them, which mammals can't. And I was explaining to my son, and I said, "There's no mammals in it," and he looked at me and went, "Except the people." So he lives in this head now, which is very sad.
You got a sharp kid.
Yeah, he's awful. And then I was thinking what's useful. And if you're a bird, it would be useful to control the wind, and that would also be useful if you've got a ship. And that's how we came up with the idea of the Gleim, who are this avian species, who they blind and clip their wings purely for their own good because they can't be trusted to look after themselves within the world. And I mean, it's obvious to us that that's horrific, and they're a slave species, but that's not how they think of it. And that kind of became the engine for the plot. Because when you meet Joron, the main character, so one reviewer called him quite rightly, he's a xenophobic drunk. And he's forced together with this creature that he thinks is nothing. And they kind of discover this friendship with something very alien, very badly treated, very distrustful. And this man who doesn't know who he is at all. And that was just this lovely friendship to write. And it's so angry. It's the glam. It's beautiful to write. You just think, yeah, everything you're angry about is right, and nobody understands it because of their world. And the slow change of these people as the way they see the world changes. That I love doing that. I love this sort of twist of people and them becoming better, because that's what I generally write about. I write about people who become better, and that's what interests me.
Yeah, I appreciate you bringing up that, magic and character are definitely some things that I want to expand upon. But I wanted to, Andrea, you brought up research and the hellhole that it can often be. I was curious, because when it comes to the sea, and RJ, you were saying that sailors would write to you and be like, you captured the essence of it, but technically it's not right at all. Or probably there's like, there are certain aspects that are right, but like the essence of it is really important, I think. But I was curious, Joshua, I'll get your take first. How do you kind of balance this feeling, this essence of like what sailing is versus the historical accuracy and technicality of this very, very detailed and rigorous world?
Yeah, it's I don't know is my first answer. And my second answer is I did some research, and like RJ, I get terribly motion sick. So I've been on a boat twice and threw up also twice, and was like in a sort of Dramamine fueled haze the whole time. And so I don't know that I have the best memory of it. The way that I sort of tried to balance this, or tried to find my way through it, is through perspective. So my main character, Kindred, has one job on the ship, and it is not dealing with the sails, and it's not managing anything else except for the hearth fire, which doesn't exist. So the only thing she cares about is the thing that I created, and she doesn't know anything else about sailing. And so in that way, I cheated yet again and just said, like, other characters deal with that. So sometimes they'll say stuff that sounds maybe vaguely shippy, but Kindred is mostly concerned. It's, she's essentially an engineer character. And so I think a lot of ship books or naval books or maritime books that involve battles or sort of skirmishes at sea will often have the perspective be one that is interested in like what's going on at the edge of the ship, et cetera, et cetera. And I was really interested in having a book that had a perspective that was mostly like, your job is to like keep the engine running. Everybody else can do their stuff. And so in that way, I hope I can sort of allow readers to participate with their own amount of sailing knowledge, and what this book gives is that. And so a lot of the research that I did was about like prairie plants, which is something that Kindred is really interested in, and sort of environmental stuff, and less about ships, which probably shows in the book. And so in that way, I think I'm kind of a fraud when it comes to writing sort of maritime fantasy, because,
I appreciate your honesty, though.
Yeah.
It reminds me of like the person on the train who's like shoveling coal into the what is it, hearth or whatever. But so it's like that person who's like, this is my job, and if you ask me anything about how trains work, I don't know shit.
Yeah,
but that's very smart.
I mean, in some ways, it feels like such a perfect metaphor in lots of ways. Like, I go through life and I like experience things through how I use them. But like, we just got an electric car recently, and I have like no clue how it works. It just seems like a big battery with wheels to me. And so if you ask me like it broke and you need to fix it now, I would think like, could we swap in a new battery? I don't know how this works, right? So, so in lots of ways, RJ was bringing up earlier the way in which life aboard a ship is really kind of regimented, and everybody has their roles. And I think I think, if you're really smart when you're writing, you can use that kind of thing to your advantage, not just on ships, but sort of anywhere, right? So you think about perspective as a way to say, like, I'm just going to make sure I'm writing through the eyes of someone who sees the stuff that I see, and I'm kind of ignoring the rest. So
yeah, I like that. And was there a particular era of naval history that you kind of pulled from in terms of like the feel and the look of your ships and that kind of thing?
I don't know. That's a good question. I think, the era of like the sort of many-masted ships, the sort of 2 and 3 masted ships that are sort of sailing around, is what I sort of think of most. But I don't think I was pulling from any sort of particular place. Yeah.
Yeah. And Andrea, what about you when it comes to, you brought up how you researched a lot of stuff and realized it's like, I have to just have this in my head and dump it for the readers because exposition.
I will join you in the bin of maritime frauds, Joshua.
Join us.
I'm like, you know what? They're relying on muscle memory. I'm not going to describe that part. So for me, it's like, okay, well, how do I get the vibe of it then? I'm like, well, I'll describe like, what does the weather feel like? What does the wind feel like? What is like the ropes feeling like? It's like, what are these things feeling like? What does it smell like? What does it look like? What does it sound like? But not like the nitty gritty. It's just like, they're going faster now, or the wind picked up, or the wind died, for me, it was just keeping it as vague as I could in that respect and focusing the details in other places. Most of the characters in my book don't know how to sail. Jovis, one of the main characters, allegedly does. And he knows more than I do, and that's all. Like, that's where I leave it at.
Yeah. Well, 2 things. RJ, you brought up earlier this thing about like jargon, and that sailing is a very jargony world. Andrea, when it came to your books, like, how did you approach that? Using specific words and specific phrases or language that readers could pick up on and kind of use to get that sense of, I'm on a boat.
So like, I didn't want to use too much of because I had considered, okay, well, there's port, starboard, all that. I didn't want to use too much of that because it is like a secondary world. I don't want it to feel like too much like, master and commander kind of thing. So I honestly avoided a lot of that too. Like there's like the prow of the boat, there's the stern of the boat, and that's like as much as I really avoided too much jargon, just because I didn't want it to feel too reminiscent of a certain time and place in our world. Yeah. So I don't know if you're supposed to do that, but that's the strategy I went with.
Yeah. Well, on that note, it's like, even though you didn't want to evoke a specific part of history, since your world is more Asian inspired, what were some real world historical inspirations for the way that you kind of represented?
So I didn't do a lot of that with the sailing in particular, but I did look up things with more like the way that they lived in relation to the ocean. Like there's like mention of people doing stilt fishing, which I found really fascinating, where you go out on stilt and then you fish from there like that, like not using like a dock or anything, right? Like that's like your equivalent. So I did do research in that respect as far as like how people related to the ocean, but not necessarily all the boat stuff.
Love that though. And on the flip side, we have RJ who loves his jargon. So how did you kind of thread the needle between, historical accuracy and, this evocation of what the sea is like, and then building on what I asked Andrea about using jargon and language as a way to, evoke that mood or kind of navigate the reader's mind a bit?
Sailing languages is really powerful. And part of our language, like taken aback, is sailing language. So it's when the wind turns on you and it stops your ship dead. You're taken aback, and so much of our language is ship language, and mine is very much based on classic Age of Sail ships. But I didn't want to just give the reader that, so I thought, well, I'll totally reinvent everything, and give it its own name that is world specific. Again, we're back to things that I would advise people not to do. It was it was not as much fun as I thought by the time I got to the third book. But like the boat has a beak, which makes sense because they hunt these big sort of weird sea monsters that have beaks, and they have spines, and these sea monsters they have and they have wings, they don't have sails, and that is all from their world. It makes sense in their world. And we don't have port and starboard, but I've entirely forgotten what he used instead of port and starboard. But it's basically, I can't remember what I called it, but it's basically the same thing. A ship is called port because that's the side you dock your ship on. It's called starboard because that's the side you used to have your tiller on. And I just used that, and I just renamed it using the same thing. So that's what I did. I renamed the entire thing so I can be even more kind of, oh, look, sailing stuff's going on. And you might not understand the sailing stuff because it's very complicated. But that's because they're using all this language that you don't know. It's much harder for somebody to call you out when you don't ever really specify what a lot of things are and go, oh, that's that. And also, a nice cheat is that Joran's an officer. So his job is often just saying, we're going that way. He doesn't actually have to understand. Or at most, more sails will go that way fast. And that, so it's around the only time I was ever quite specific in the book is they use big crossbows rather than cannon. And there's a very detailed explanation of how you load these crossbows. My editor said, do people really want to read 3 pages of how to load a crossbow? And I was like, yes, that is what naval books are about. You cannot have a naval book without a very long explanation of how you load the weapons. That's just got to be in. But I also used it later on to time a battle, because you get the reader used to this thing, and then when the battle's coming on, you know how long something takes them. So I'm not a fan of doing things just so you can go, yes, I came up with this very complicated thing. Come up with a very complicated thing, but have a reason for it later on is fun. And also, if you're doing ships, the artist for Patrick O'Brien's Aubrey Maturin books, whose name also escapes me, I should have prepared that really, because I knew it would come to him, has done some books all about the British Navy of the Napoleonic War, and it tells you how many people are on a ship and how long the ships are and where people stayed on the ships, which is really, really useful. Do not read the Tide Child books and try and make a map of that ship from my description, because I'm pretty sure it changes in every book. That's just
It's okay. They're made of like giant skeletons, so
magic.
Yeah, exactly.
But magic stuff's happening.
There was one moment in the Bone Child that I love, where it was like the main character Jordan is an officer, and he's wearing these boots that he had to break in because anyone who buys leather boots or they suck at first. Yeah, those sucked. Those boots that RJ's wearing, those were probably so sore on your feet for a while. But then there's a fun comment where it's like this one antagonistic character who's calling out, it's like, why did they get boots and we have to be in bare feet? And then another character is just like, shut the fuck up, we wear bare feet because we have to climb up the ropes. And it's like, just like small details like that where I'm like, okay, I really that's the kind of thing that really draws you into the world. And RJ, you brought up character earlier, how you like to write stories about people getting better. What does a secondary world set in a nautical situation with magic and all of the things that come with the world building that you've done, what does that offer you from a character building standpoint?
I don't think this is one of those things that some people think. I think that other people strongly disagree with, and that's fine. You're allowed to. I'm often wrong. I really believe that genre is just clothes that stories wear, and all that matters is your characters react in a believable way to where they live. But if you're writing about people, people don't particularly change. Like if you could go back to ancient Egypt, it would be a strange and mysterious world, but the way people acted and what motivates them is mostly the same. It's, am I safe? Are those I love safe? Can I survive the night? And then we get more complicated after that. But those are sort of primal desires. And creating a world or a ship is a lot like creating a character, in that you don't create whole people. It's impossible. You create a skeleton for the reader to hang their ideas on and then fill it in. But I don't for me, because I write other genres as well, that there's no difference in a person in a fantasy book and a person in a crime novel. They're just people, and people have to be real and accurate, if that makes sense.
Yeah. I love this idea of the skeleton that people hang their ideas off of. That's really nice, because it's like you don't want to give them too much information, just enough that they're able to use their own inner imagination to add the flesh and the fat and all the good stuff to the characters. Andrea, what when it comes to the Drowning Empire books, building off what RJ is talking about with character, what kinds of opportunities did the world that you created give for the characters and their relationships or the conflicts that arose?
I think it allows, well, I mean, I think obviously it contributes to their culture, which can contribute to the characters and their motivations in some ways. But I mean, I do agree with RJ that people are very similar the world over. So when you're looking at what's motivating them, although the setting may play some small part because it has influenced their culture, I don't see it as big a player in the characters. So I feel like for the setting, it's more like the plot and the vibes for me. Like you definitely get like a certain vibe from the environment and just how it feels to you as a reader. I mean, yes, I think it does in some way, small way, contribute to the character through the way that it influences their culture. But when it comes down to base motivations, like my characters are like, well, hey, I got to find my wife, or, hey, I have to like reclaim my place as heir, or, like, hey, I'm like having this difficulty with my significant other. It's like these kinds of base conflicts are the same. And there may be like small things like influencing it, like, oh, culturally, like they're, taught to respect their elders. So going against your father is like a really like big deal. But when it comes down to the very like base conflicts, I think that those are going to be very similar the world over and in your secondary world.
Yeah. Although RJ, you brought up earlier that the ship itself is like this confined space, and the regimented structure of many sort of like maritime vessels and things like that, there's kind of like an inherent opportunities for relationship building between the different peoples on the ship, or a growing trust or distrust on the ship, and the kind of conflict that can arise from that. Joshua, did you have any, since your character is from like an engineering perspective, the one who controls the hearth fire, what kinds of, just based on the fact that they're on the confines of a ship, what kinds of, opportunities for relationship and conflict come up just based on that itself?
Yeah, I mean, I think I totally agree with what RJ and Andrea have both said. I think we make a lot out of the differences in genre and sort of what effect it has on stories.
Right.
And yeah, I think I fundamentally agree with the stuff about character. I think for me, the kind of like confined nature of a ship offers I think it's like an accelerant for tension and conflict in characters. And so, my book is really built around this woman named Kindred who is trying to weigh like the importance to her of individual goals versus communal goals. And so if you're part of a ship and you're trying to do your own thing, you're going to be pretty fucked, right? Like you have to be a unit working together towards something. Otherwise you run into trouble, right? Like everybody has their role. Everybody has the thing that they're supposed to be doing as part of this bigger thing. And so I think like that in this story plays out in my story plays out in like kind of unique ways, but it seems like a pretty fundamental thing in life, right? Like I'm part of this community and I have responsibilities to that community, and also I'm myself. And so I'm thinking about how to sort of weigh these things. And so I think the confined nature of a ship, especially when you're not close to land, right? If you're sort of far out or if you're on a journey somewhere, these sorts of conflicts get sort of brought to a head much more quickly maybe than they would if you can just sort of leave the space and, say like, I need my own time. And like what that looks like is I'm going to walk 10 feet away and we're still in the same room, right? Like, okay, have your own time, but we're still here. And so, yeah, there's that. I also think like, this, RJ brought this up earlier, like and we've been talking about it a little bit, but like the sea as a metaphor, I think is just so valuable when it comes to character, right? Like we use the stuff around characters to describe characters. And so, when people look out at this thing that is just itself and they start ascribing value or meaning to it, that says a lot about them and almost nothing about the thing, right? That, the sea is what it is. It's a big body of water that has stuff in it, right? But when somebody looks at it and says like, wow, this is like life, like maybe, but it's interesting that you think it is, right? Or this is like death, or, wow, this is like relationships, like, yeah, I don't know, maybe, but the fact that you think it is and that you're using it to sort of draw meaning, I think tells us a lot about that person.
Yes.
And that itself is really meaningful, right? So I think like, this becomes really important for characters. And it's such like a great opportunity, I think. And so like in my books, Kindred looks at the sea and sees a thing that I don't necessarily think is right or true, but the fact that she does, I think is pretty important. Yeah.
I love that. Yeah. Like the meaning that is described is very, very powerful. And I think that also kind of applies, since we are in fantastical spaces, to something like magic. Magic is very much akin to the ocean in that it's vast and often inexplicable. And the meaning that comes from it is like you said, Joshua, it's ascribed by an individual, and they are the ones who, give potency to it. But at the same time, magic is very cool because it's like, the ocean has storms and giant waves and these things that are like physical representations of its power. And magic, it also kind of plays in a similar way. And Andrea, I want to get your take on this because I know you love magic systems, but why does like this ocean setting blend so well, with a magic? I think in yours you have two magic systems, right? Like a harder and a softer magic system.
Yeah. So, I mean, the hard magic system is centered around bones, which, you don't need the ocean for.
You just need humans. That's all.
Yeah. You just need some people and some body parts. And then the softer magic system is more of an elemental one, centered around like water and air and earth. So that definitely, being on the ocean, obviously that's like a huge source of water. And it also allows them to control some of what's going on in the ocean. But also when they're on the ocean, then they can't use their earth magic, because there's no earth to be found. So yeah, definitely the softer magic system relies, a lot on, where they're located. The wind is like cool, they can use it anywhere.
Cool stuff. Yeah. But how is it that you feel that magic system kind of helps to contextualize the world and its creatures or its conflicts and politics and that kind of stuff?
Oh God, that's a difficult question. I don't know. I mean, how does it contextualize it? There's like a lot of stuff that I can't really talk about either because it goes into the actual like history of the world and the mysteries that you kind of uncover as you go along. So, I mean, the most I can say is that there is a reason for it. But I can't talk about it until people have read all 3 books, which is like makes these kind of panels like really difficult.
It's okay.
But it does like, I mean, it does have a lot of like historical significance and the way that things have ended up where they are because it is the soft magic system is extremely powerful, and the people that were wielding it before kind of did it unwisely, which leads to people in the current world very untrustworthy of these magic users. So I guess like that's the most context I can provide at this point in time. So,
we don't want to spoil it too much. Yeah, just wait for book 3 and then everything will make sense. All right, so RJ, I'm going to toss it to you now because you brought up magic earlier in the sense of the Gulaim. Is that how you call it? Mm. So that magic, but also kind of like the sort of the folklore kind of. There's almost this like magical quality to the whale-like creatures. I think they're called like Arachisian as well. Yeah. So how did you Arachisians? Yeah. So how did I mean, it sounds like the magic in this world is very much a part of the nautical setting and the themes that you wanted to kind of approach in the book.
Yeah, one of the things that fascinates me is power and the way people use it in bad ways. And magic is a brilliant expression of that as a resource. And the Gulaim can control the wind, which is a really obvious magical power if you're writing a naval book. It's just like, that would be the most useful thing in this world. Because there has to be a reason for it outside that. And there is, which I can't explain to you without ruining the book. But what interested me about them is how they have this power that's incredibly useful, and the humans in the world have immediately gone, well, we better look after you then. Mm-hmm. And they're basically a slave species. Because the people in this world are awful. They're deeply unpleasant. It's taken a very wrong turn somewhere. And that was the thinking behind the magic, that it had to be useful and it has to have its own story, which is how we get to Joran and the Gulaim. And one of the things I like about this to do with magic, it's occurred to me and I've forgotten, is we meet other Gulaim and they have names. This one that's on their ship doesn't, because it is absolutely rejected their world. It's just like, no, I'm not letting you give me one of your names. I'll have my name. Very difficult to write when there's a species called the Gulaim and a character called the Gulaim. I regretted that by book 3. But then we have these massive sea monsters, like the size of islands. It's so hard to speak about this without being spoilery. But they've gone. They've gone, and they've gone because they think they've killed them all. There's lots of magic. There's big magic creatures, and there's the little ones that can't fly because they've been treated terribly. So yeah, the magic is a jigsaw that works, but it's working in the background. And there's a point in book 3 where, or maybe even book 2, where you suddenly go, oh, I get that now. Yeah. Which is what you're always trying to create with the book. Yeah, but I just got Joshua here. Can I tell him just how massively jealous I am of his idea still?
Go for it.
The first time I saw that, I was just genius. Oh.
It can be yours for $10. That's you just give me $10 and it's your idea now.
Cheap.
You can
that's
have
cheap.
it.
Yeah, for the price of a book.
That's worth it.
That's right. Yeah, that's
right. But yeah, RJ, I love that because it's like the as I was asking Andrea about like the contextualization. It's like the Gulaim are kind of a caste of society that have essentially been enslaved, and that speaks so much about the people and the world that they live in, and then their sort of morality, and how they approach a species that is basically like, we're going to use you as like wind fuel, you know, which is really brutal. Yeah, go for it.
Can I tell you how they came about? It's a proper writer thing. This we like to sort of sit there going, oh yeah, I sat there and I planned all this out. It took me a long time. I played badminton with a friend of mine called Matt, and he's kind enough to let me talk my books at him. And it's part of my process is talking my books at him. And I was telling him about how there will be these wizards that control the wind, and there were only birds. They were the only animal in this world. And as we were walking out, he went, I love the idea of those bird wizards. And I was like, no, birds and wizards.
No.
And by the time I got home, I'd had this amazing idea for these bird wizards. And next time I saw him, I was like, oh yeah, I've had this amazing idea for bird wizards. Like, which is why one of the books is dedicated to my friend Matt. Because his mistake was like, oh, I've won. That's a good one.
Yeah. To all the writers out there, get yourself a mat and play badminton.
Yeah, absolutely.
And Joshua, what about you? You know, when it comes to these magical hearth fires and the way that they act as sort of like this linchpin for any attempt at crossing this grass sea.
Yeah.
You know, because it's like, otherwise you just fall and you're fucked, you know?
Yeah.
But the fact that this magic is so inherent to transportation and everything like that, what was your kind of approach when it came to creating that magic system and incorporating it into the world that you created?
Yeah. So, I think I was thinking a lot about Kindred as a kind of engineering kind of character, and sort of where power comes from, and the way in which power is so often a thing that comes from the consumption of resources. And, you know, like so much of the book, the first book and then the second book too, is about sort of scarcity of resources. And I think a lot about like bigger environmental issues and how scarcity is often at the heart of things, and how consumption is often at the heart of many of our problems today. And so I wanted a magic system that was built around consumption. So for Kindred, it's bones, and captain's bones in particular. And so this is a sort of extra super scarce resource. And so, then I'm interested in like, I think in a lot of kind of shippy books, it sounds pretty cool to be captain. You tell people what to do, and then you have pretty big quarters, and you get to sort of swagger around, and you maybe get the coolest hats out of anyone, and etc. And so I wanted a world where there was a real sort of filter to be captain, right? If you're going to be a captain, what that means is that you have to go through this ritual, and suddenly you yourself are a resource that could be burned in the future.
Very cool.
And so that's sort of how the hearthfire works. But even the sort of broader magic system is really, I think, just built around fire and consumption. And so you can burn prairie plants and sort of extract the magic from them if you're sort of singing the right songs. And that too is about like, what do we do with these resources? And so the sea, which is full of these plants, can be used for like medicinal purposes. It can be used for food. It can be used for clothing, etc. But it can also be used for sort of raw power. And so all of that comes from consumption. I think where I struggled and where I'm envious of RJ, I've only read the first of the Tide Child books, but I'm like deeply envious of like how perfectly the magic system and the world building is like integrated into story in that book. And I think the thing that I struggled most with is like coming up with this neat thing, or the thing that I thought was pretty neat, and then moving it outside of the perspective of like just this character or just this kind of use value, right? So it's like, you can burn bones on ships. Yeah, cool. And then you sort of get off a ship and you're like, and now I'm in a world that doesn't have that, right? I'm like walking around on this island, and that sort of doesn't exist until we get back on the ship. And so I think it's really hard to come up with the cool thing, but then the really hard thing is to sort of thread it through the rest of the book to sort of weave it into the bigger tapestry. And it's a thing that I struggle with a lot.
Of the captain's bones being this resource. I just think that's fantastic.
Thanks.
He must just always be looking at her, just thinking, you're after my bones.
Yeah. Absolutely. It's like a weird sort of cannibalism type thing, right? You look around, and you're like, I could use that person. That And so then like pirates coming by and looting a ship, right? You have to think like, what are the real resources on a ship? And maybe it's loot that you have, or stuff that you've harvested, but also the captain themselves is a resource, right? Because you're thinking, well, I can sail for a long time on that. And so, you sort of, you loot a ship and, you're taking, I don't know. Yeah. So it has all these really interesting ramifications that,
I love
that may be
so
explored.
Much,
who knows? Who could say?
Yeah. I can't wait for book 2. Cause it's like, it's like that it's like you enter onto a ship and it's like you are giving your life to that thing, this hierarchy, this structure known as a ship. And at the same time, it's like you are literally giving yourself to that ship. And I like what you brought up about like the pirates. It's like they're looking for resources, but the fact that like a person could be a resource. I think when it comes to nautical battles, there's always this fear that it's like, obviously there's a fight for survival, but there's also a hierarchy of necessary survival in terms of like which personnel on the ship. It's like you really need to survive. So I think that adds to like another layer of tension. And RJ, I want to toss it to you in terms of how you approach battles, because you were talking about earlier the way like all the mechanical details of winding up this bow, but then using it later on to give a sense of pacing and sort of like timing to the reader. I thought that was like a really cool idea to have that cue. But when it comes to the overall like pacing and tension of a battle in general, how do you approach that?
So hard. it's really, really hard. Because if you're fighting, if you've got a normal like fight with swords, you need to know where everybody is. And that's how you start. And then once you have ships involved, you need to know where everybody is on your ship, and then where the other ships are, and the ones on your side and the ones on their side, and then how they'll react to each other. And it is, I think some things are really difficult to describe how you do them, because when you're doing it, you kind of enter a fugue state where I write very close to my characters. So, and you're with Joron in the battle, so you see what he sees. And usually there will be a meeting beforehand where they say what they want to do. And you see that unfold through his eyes when it inevitably goes wrong. But I'm not someone who writes action as in this happened and then this happened and this happened. My aim when I'm writing action is to make you think, oh my God, I never ever want to be involved in anything like that. And as long as I live, I want it to be awful and terrifying as well as kind of exciting. And that's how I approach it. But when I wrote the Bone Ships and I went and I read it back, there's a scene towards the end where there's a 3-on-3 ship battle. And it's the only time I've ever got lost in my own writing when I came back to it. I found I was holding my breath. And that's my favourite thing that I've ever written, I think. Because it works and I can see it. But the other good thing that you can do if you're writing ship stuff is there's a lot of battles that actually happened. And you can nick them. You can just... Patrick O'Brien, he just nicks them. And in the third Bone Ship book, the first third of the book is a homage to Patrick O'Brien. My favourite scene in all naval fiction is where Aubrey and Captain Aubrey is chased down by a Dutch ship called the Waxham Hyde that has the advantage of them. And it's in the film Master and Commander, but it's an American ship in Master and Commander because it's a French ship. I can't remember in the film because it's the Waxham Hyde in my head. And I, for legal reasons, don't recreate it, but I definitely pay homage to my favourite scene. So you can do that, and you can go into history. If you're doing this, was it Cochrane? in Hornblower, the captain of the ship in Hornblower is based on a real person. I've forgotten his name. It's gone out of my head. And if you read up on him, he's just insane. The stuff he did. He was just like taking massive 100-cannon ships with like a 20-gun brig. They're sailing underneath where their cannons could reach.
Mm-hmm.
So he could like sail up to it, fire his cannons, and they couldn't get him. And there's loads of stuff like that you can nick, which is basically what I did for quite a bit of it. I mean, the 3-on-3 ship battle is Nelson's tactics of going in between ships and stuff like that. But
just
yeah,
liberally plucking from history.
yeah. It's there. It's a bit more difficult when you get massive sea dragons involved.
Yeah.
Because there's not as much history with that.
Not as many of those happened historically.
No.
Yeah.
No, they're missing.
Well, Joshua, what's your approach when it comes to battles and things like that?
Yeah, I also pulled from history just to get a sense of like how things would go, but also, I was always on the lookout for like really great details or really sort of shiny moments from particular battles that I could pull. I think for me, what's most appealing about sort of nautical battles is like how unwieldy ships can be in so if it's like two people and they're fighting hand to hand, you can just try and punch the other person, or you can just swing your sword or whatever. And so action can kind of happen instantaneously if you want it to, but there's so much setup that's required and so much kind of posturing and sort of maneuvering into place with ship stuff that I think if done well, it can really sort of heighten the tension and be really sort of maybe not beautiful, but really nicely. I don't know. It's like a dance, right? Yeah, exactly right. So, the sort of buildup is just as much fun as the actual maybe fight itself. And there are different phases of it, and everybody has their part to play, and all of that sort of stuff. And so, that kind of thing is like really appealing to me. And also just like space is so interesting, right? You can see the fight coming from a little ways away, and so. If you're standing next to somebody and you decide you're going to get into a fight with them, it just sort of happens, right? You're not sort of looking at them from 100 yards away, slowly walking toward each other, each shouting, "I'm going to punch you," right?
Yeah.
Whereas with ships, there can be some of that, right? So there can be a chase, or there can be this sort of slow sort of maneuvering, things like that I think are just super cool. So I start the Forever Sea with a chase, right? With the sort of promise of a battle that doesn't happen then, but I think even that, right, it sort of looms over you, right? So you're thinking like, what happens if they catch us, and are they going to board us, or are we going to have this sort of skirmish, or what? And so I think all of that stuff is just so cool.
Yeah, me too.
The other thing,
go for it, RJ.
The other thing with it is it's like you're running up to somebody to punch them, and you're like 20 meters away, but they can punch you because they've got really long arms.
That's right.
Yeah. I was going to bring up range. It's just like the cannonball is like it's getting closer and closer.
Yeah, that's right. And yeah.
The really classic naval thing is the officer stood there and they're taking fire and they don't move because that's not what you did in his. And I use that they have to stand there under fire, and I'm power and people in power. So a thing that I really enjoyed doing in these books was when you meet Lucky Mayus, the shipwife. She seems like a superhuman character who feels no fear, can do everything, makes decisions, knows what she's doing. And Joron, by the final book, has moved through the ship and become her in a lot of ways. But because you're with him, you see behind that. And you know that that's how he would appear to everybody. But because you're in his head, you know that he second guesses everything. He's always scared. And then you realize that she must have been. And probably worse because of the situation she's in at the beginning of the book. And I really enjoyed that. And I think the isolation of command on a ship is quite unique to give you that insight into what it's like to be in charge.
Yeah, it's like that underlying vulnerability that most people will just have to either ignore or assume. But I also think that applies to like the ship as a whole, because it's like the entire crew, they have their posts. And so when it comes to something like a rousing speech, you know, everyone's cheering. It's just like, yeah, let's go get them, you know, let's go kill our enemy, what have you. But underneath that, there's definitely a ton of these crew members who are just shitting their pants and it's like, I might die, you know, and I think that's why it's so cool to be internally inside the head of a character, to think like, all right, that's the thing that's going to kill me, you know, that ship over there, you know. And I think that adds a lot of tension too, because it's that really overwhelming internality of just like, well, you know, I've got the imposing sea, so, you know, my ship might get sunk and I'll die that way, or it'll just get like blown up by cannon fire or a bow or what have you. It's like, there's so many possibilities. I absolutely love that. And RJ, you brought up at the beginning Godzilla, and I think sea creatures and just the mysterious monstrosities that might be lurking beneath the waves, or something that for me is so fascinating. You know, that's why like whaling history is so interesting to me, to think like reading the accounts of people who were on these ships and kind of just like experiencing these creatures without a sense of, you know, biology that we have today, but just from the sense of like majesty and wonder and awe. Like it's something that encapsulates for me the word sublime. It's like, it's so awesome that it's terrifying. And I love that about the sea. So Joshua, for you, when it came to like the sublime nature of what lies beneath the grass sea, for me is like a like really, really cool part of your book. If you want to comment on that.
For me too. I mean, that's so much of what drew me to it. And I think, you know, when I think of sea stories, I do think a lot about sort of what's below, and you know, things about scope and scale of the things that might be down there, you know, stories about like leviathans and these sorts of things that I think, you know, are sort of permeate a lot of sea stories. And so for me, this becomes a really important thing, right? There's a scene in the Forever Sea where Kindred's ship nearly gets ruined, or, well, I don't want to spoil it. Perhaps it does get ruined. Who could say?
Read to find out.
Yeah, read to find out. The second book is just this sea creature that ruined Kindred's boat. We just switch perspectives entirely, and no, we don't. I'm just kidding. But that I think. Sublime is such a great word for it. When I think of sublime, I think of the process of looking at something that's so enormous and that's so, in some ways, maybe alien or foreign or strange or huge or whatever it might be, and feeling yourself to be so small in comparison. And so it's this sort of immediate moment of sort of seeing yourself in relation to this and realizing like, I'm just a little speck next to this. And you know, like the Godzilla is such a great example of this, right? You see Godzilla in that, I think I'm thinking of the right one, where Godzilla swims underneath the aircraft carrier, and you realize like this isn't just like a big shark or something. This is a thing on a completely different scale and scope, and people aren't ready for this, right? For me, that's so much of the appeal of like the sea, right? Who knows what could be down there? Who knows what size of things could be down there? And the moments where you sort of come into contact with it, your perspective on things is totally changed.
Yeah, it's like the sailors who would encounter sperm whales that would have these giant like scars and gashes and stuff on, and like what could have done that to this?
That's right.
And that like encapsulates it so beautifully for me, because it's like nobody knew about like giant squid, you know. They kind of elaborated that into what would become Kraken and the myth of the Kraken. But for me, it's like just like there's scars on this Leviathan. Like what? Yeah,
it's like there's like a promise of it's like the promise of another world, right? A world that you don't have access to. And that's so appealing, right? It's so cool. It just, you know, it's like there's a doorway, and if you walk through it, things are going to be weird. And, you know, it reminds me in some ways of Rail Sea by China Mieville, right? It's like kind of a shippy book. It doesn't really count because people ride around on trains, right? On train tracks. But it's a kind of retelling of Moby Dick, and they hunt what do they hunt? Moles, like enormous moles, right?
Yeah.
In that book. And there's a scene where they kill one of these moles, and it's like, it's just gargantuan. It's, it is like the size of a mountain, basically. And they're harvesting this thing and cutting it up and whatever. And just like the scope and scale of it is just, it's incredible. I remember reading that and thinking like, A, I'm grossed out, but B, this is incredible. It's amazing. Yeah,
this is like just nasty moles.
It's pretty gross, but it's cool in a way. It's like very China medieval, right? There's like, you're always a little grossed out, but also a little entranced.
Yeah, it's like that whole new weird vibe. I love it.
Yeah.
And RJ, you also captured that sort of sublime nature really well in your books. So how did you approach it when you were coming up with these massive sea creatures and how to represent them on the page?
Yeah, I wanted that kind of sense of wonder, because it takes you a long time for you to see the first one in the first book.
Mm-hmm.
And they have the heads of them mounted on the front of their ships. That's why they call them a beak, because they've got like a big ram and it's the beak of these creatures. So they think they have an idea of the scale of these creatures. But they're wrong, because the ones they were hunting were just the little ones.
Mm-hmm.
And the one they come across is not. And I think, and the first time you can play tricks with scale by not showing everything. The first time they see it, people in boats are trying to kill it, and a flipper comes out the water and it just wrecks them completely, and they're all like, "Oh my god, what is that?" And it's just huge. They can't scale it. They're struggling with it. And that's what I wanted to get across. And it's not until later in the book where they're actually above it, because they've had to go on land and they look down, they see the true scale of it, and they can't. They're just like, yeah, this is a lot bigger than, maybe we can't kill that.
But I love how it's like it takes you to be on land to be able to understand the true scale of this thing. This sea creature, you need to be on land to be able to actually like see how fucking massive it is.
They're looking down and they can see their own ships, and they're just like, yeah, that's a lot bigger than we are. We might not be able to complete this mission. But that's what, and you meet more of them as you go through the trilogy, and you find out more of their secrets.
Mm-hmm.
And also that thing you said about the Leviathan and the scars on the sperm whale. I thought about what would something that big eat, because it's going to be massive, hasn't it? So you do meet it. There's no sheep or ship moment in book 3 where they come across what the Kesians eat and get between them, which was joyous to write, just because there are these two huge beasts that don't care. That to them the ship is not even alive. They don't really pick it up. They're just, one of them wants dinner and the other one doesn't want to be dinner, and that was sort of fun to write from the scale of a person, because all they're thinking about is we really need to get away. So this is really, and that was sort of joyous. I think it all comes down to writing it as your characters and seeing it through their eyes in this world, and then you present it as that, and it becomes real for the reader.
Yeah, for sure. Also, just a quick comment. I find it hilarious that things that like blue whales, this massive creature that people have sort of idolized for such a long time. It's like, what does it eat? Oh, it turns out it just like sifts krill through its. It's so ironic. This is like microscopic creature is what it actually eats. But just to go for it, RJ.
There's more going on with the Kesians in this world. Power has come through being born whole. A lot of people aren't. A lot of people are missing bits of their body, and some people pick it up in book 1. But not everybody does. That these massive dragons are clearly nuclear powered. Because there are places where they would take them and cut them apart and nothing grows there. And you'll die if you go there. And there are all these clues.
Yeah.
And I liked that idea that maybe maybe there's something slightly unnatural. And there's a whole thing going on in the background of this world that you don't really know about.
Yeah.
It doesn't feel like that. How does something evolve that? And I like that as well.
RJ is clearly inspired by Godzilla, if you didn't know that already. But
I do a writing podcast called Writeopolis. You'll have to come on it, Joshua, at some point. And one of the questions we ask every guest is, who's better, Godzilla or King Kong? I don't know if you can guess what team I'm on, but
I think I may be on the same team.
Yes, you can definitely come on.
Yes, all right. I passed the first test.
Yes, exactly. Yeah, as a human and a former ape, it's like fucking Kong. No, it's obviously Godzilla.
Yeah, obviously. It's not even a question. Yeah.
Exactly. All right. Well, just to bring things to a close, I would like each of you to share some writing advice for folks out there who are looking to approach, nautical fantasy or creating their own world, even if it doesn't have to do with nautical fantasy. If you want to share some general writing advice as well. Joshua, do you want to start?
I don't want to, but I will.
We could just give it to RJ.
No, it's whatever. Okay. I'll try my best. I think the best writing advice I have ever received, and so it's the writing advice that I give, and it's general writing advice, but I think it works for this, is read everything. And so, I think if you want to play around in a genre, read around in that genre, but also read everything. I think part of the fun of writing in a genre is like bringing in outside influences, right? So, if all you're reading is maritime books, if you read all, I don't know how many Master and Commander books there are, all 197 of them, or however many there actually are, that's great. Like, that's great, and you should read them. I think they're great books, but also read other stuff, so that when you're writing that, you're not just reproducing the thing that you've read. You're bringing something new and fresh to it. And so I think, the reason I started writing is because I read a lot and I thought, this is so cool and I want to try this, and I want to respond to the stuff that I've read. And so I think, not leaving out the reading part is important. So that's my writing advice.
For sure. I like that. And like RJ said, it's like, the more you read, the more ideas you can nip from here and there.
Totally. Yeah, totally. Yeah. Read and then steal is that's right. Yeah. Yeah.
Reinterpret. If you will.
Yeah. Call it what you will. Yeah. Potato.
Be influenced by.
Yeah. Be influenced. Sure. Yeah.
RJ, what about you?
Joshua's advice is extremely good. I'm going to go with another bit of very general advice, which is the best thing I ever heard, and it absolutely freed me from that place where I was kind of thinking, am I doing it right? And is this how a story should work? And somebody said, what works for you is what works. And it is just the greatest thing. All writing advice is bad unless it happens to be good for you. If it's uncomfortable, don't force yourself to do it. Definitely don't try and write like I do. It's awful.
How many times have you brought up, it's just like, I kind of regret that?
I constantly regret everything I do. In the first Assassin's book, I thought it was really clever because I came up with this fighting system, which everything has a name and a number because it's all based on dance. And I thought, that's really good. It's got a really lyrical poetry to it. And then I got to the second book and thought, oh yeah, they all have to be the same. I was like, I didn't write any of that down.
Regret is an important part of the writing process too.
Yes,
Yes.
Write what works for you, and regret is inevitable. Awesome. Well, to bring our high seas adventure to its end, I would like each of you to recommend a book, film, or TV show that you think is an essential nautical story. I'll share two, just because I'm the host and I can do whatever I want. I love the Master and Commander movie. I have yet to read the books, but the movie for me is one of those. It's a masterclass in using its space to really give its characters the best opportunities to shine. And using the sea, like the sea in the Master and Commander movie is such a like everyone was mentioning, it's like this insanely massive force all on its own, but it really captures both sides of it, the beauty and the terror of the sea. And so that for me is really good. And if anyone wants to read a nonfiction source, there's a book called 2 Years Before the Mast, and that is by Richard Henry Donna Jr. And that one's really cool. It's a memoir about like a voyage from Boston to California. But I read that funny enough, I took like a maritime history course in university just because like I need credits. That sounds cool. But it actually ended up being really interesting. And so I found a bunch of books through that were really fascinating. And it was like more hands-on accounts and memoirs and that kind of stuff. And 2 Years Before the Mast, it's a bit dry. It's a memoir, deal with it. But in terms of like information and feeling, it's really, really cool. Joshua, what about you?
Yeah, I haven't heard of that book. I'm gonna check it out. It sounds really cool. I've mentioned it already, but I think I don't know if it's essential or not, but I really like it. The Scar by China Mieville, I think is really great. It's got a lot of the stuff that we've been talking about, a big kind of unknowable creature below, and the kind of bottle episode-y type thing of ship stuff. And yeah, it's a super interesting book in lots of ways. It is I think my favorite of his, and it's it's one that I think not a lot of people talk about. So check it out if you haven't. Yeah. I have RJ's book, The Bone Ships, over there. I was going to run and grab it and then have that be my recommended book. But I think if I get up, I'm going to knock over my microphone. So also read RJ's books. Yeah.
Yeah. Well, I recommend everyone here, go check out the Drowning Empire trilogy. Go check out RJ's books. Go check out Joshua's book as well. Joshua, what about you? RJ, what about your recommendation?
I'm just sitting here being quietly angry that Adrian didn't tell me about 2 years before the Mast 4 years ago when he didn't know me. But before I started the Bone Ships, because I can't forgive that. I'm sorry.
I can't forgive you in hindsight. Well, shit.
Yes. I have not read Joshua's book. Yeah, it's on my list of many, many things I have not got to. But I'm just going to say it is the greatest idea. I'm so jealous about the idea. Maybe that's partly why I've not read it yet. But I just love it, and I've given it a lot of love on Twitter whenever I've seen it, because I just think it's something. Yeah. If you like, I'm going to give a 2-tier recommendation. If you like your naval fiction adventuring, you don't really know much about ships, and you don't want a bit of a struggle, Hornblower is much fun. But Patrick O'Brien's Aubrey Maturin books, the film is lovely, and I love the film, but it's not as good as the books. It's easier to start from the beginning. There's 21, though the 21st one isn't finished because he died. But HMS Surprise is the closest one to my heart. It's the one I love. It has my favourite scene in all literature, where it ends with the phrase, "Sir, you have debauched my sloth." And if that doesn't make you want to read a book, then you're dead to me. Because they're beautiful. You can probably describe them as like 299 pages of people talking about ships and then 1 page of action. But it's about a friendship between two people who shouldn't get on, and they're just beautiful, quite touching. Nice. And God, he cannot write women though. He really cannot write women. You could skip those bits, just go straight to the sea. But yeah, they're beautiful books, especially with the ships.
The name HMS Surprise alone is awesome. I love that.
Yeah, it's very good.
I'll read that.
And the real ship.
I'll read that to make it up for you for not telling you about 2 years before the Mast 4 years ago.
Okay, I'll
a debt paid.
Yeah.
I don't know if I was going to look up the name of the chap, but I've lost my. There it is. Who is the captain? I can see the actor. You can see the actor, and you're thinking of the name of the actor.
Yeah. But not the name of the character.
Yeah, and I can't remember the name of the actor either, which is even worse. Hornblower, because I've read a book about him, and it's just superb.
For anyone that's listening, RJ's looking something up on his phone.
I'm looking something up on my phone.
The anticipation is building.
Yeah. Oh, thanks, Wikipedia. Don't mention who his captain is, which is the most important bit of any.
Even more anticipation.
Yeah.
Yeah.
While RJ is looking this up, can I also make a pitch for Moby Dick, which I know is like talked about all the time?
How dare you?
I know, but it's super funny. It's really weird. And if you just imagine that it's a fantasy novel in which the magic system is digressions, it totally works as a fantasy novel. It's really good.
Damn.
Yeah. Yeah, okay. It's really good. Yeah.
I haven't read Moby Dick in a long time, but it's about time that I go and read it again. You just resold me on that.
Okay, cool.
Yeah. I love that. A magic system of digressions.
Yeah, it is. It totally is. Yeah. I mean, he's perhaps a problematic author in more than one way. And I think that book is pretty problematic in some ways, but I think that there are parts that are really cool. And I think it's like really funny, which I was not expecting the first time I took a swing at it.
Yeah. Arda, did you find it?
No, I've absolutely failed.
That's fine.
Sorry. But
fine.
Look, read Hornblower, his captain. Look up him. He's a fascinating figure.
Well, on the note of RJ's failure, our journey has come to an end.
We've sunk.
But we've sunk. Yeah. I was gonna say you're a damn fine crew to sail with, but we just shit the bed, and the creature just.
It's fitting. It's fitting somehow.
If you could let everyone know where they could find you on social media, Joshua, I'll start with you.
Yep, on Twitter, and who knows how much longer Twitter will exist, I guess, at this point. Who could say? I'm Johnson Joshua P. I have an Instagram that I never use, and I don't even know what I don't know what my Instagram username is. But you can email me at johnson.joshua.p@gmail.com if you want. Awesome. I would love to hear your boating advice and shipping advice about the things that I got wrong. Yep.
All the sailors out there get to Joshua.
Yeah, that's right. That's right.
And RJ, what about you?
I'm on Twitter. If you search RJ Barker, you'll find me. Actual Twitter name is really stupid. It's just a lot of vowels and consonants.
I'll link to it anyways.
Yes. And my website is rjbarker.co.uk, and you can contact me through that. If you have shipping and sailing advice, though, please send it to Joshua.
He can forward it to RJ.
I've gotten it. I was planning to just forward these to you, RJ. So we're just gonna be in this constant
forever,
just passing it back and forth. Yeah.
And like Joshua, I have an Instagram, but I've no idea what it is. And I have a Mastodon as well as RJ Barker.
Not the band.
That I do understand. Too old now.
I tried Mastodon, and I think the learning curve is too steep for me.
I've never even bothered either. Yeah. And Andrea had to step out early, but her Twitter is Andrea G. Stewart. So if you want to go check her out, and thank you to her for joining us as well. And thank you, RJ and Joshua. It was a real pleasure to hang out with you guys. I appreciate it.
Lovely.
Yeah, thanks for having us on. It was great.